Last week, Phil Spencer and a host of other people took to the witness stand in court in a battle against the FTC, who filed to block the acquisition of Activision Blizzard by Microsoft. As many of you may know, Sony has been trying to block this since the announcement back in 2020. Well, things have finally come to a head as hearings are finally taking place, and boy did this get spicy real quick. There is a lot to talk about here, so let's get started. First, we will start with Jim Ryan, who some of you may know is Phil Spencer's counterpart with Sony. He has been spearheading this movement to block the deal, and due to this case going to court, he has been forced to produce documents that he would really rather have not shared. He has repeatedly stated publicly that if this deal goes through, that PlayStation's business would never recover, and that games like Call of Duty would become exclusive, leaving Sony high and dry. Well, in private emails, he stated that he knows that Call of Duty is not going to become exclusive, and that PlayStation's business would in fact be fine and virtually unaffected by this deal. This part is really important, as it is in part why the FTC filed for an injunction of the deal. So now we have evidence that states Sony was misleading the public just to prevent Microsoft from gaining a better foothold into the market. During the first day of proceedings, we learned that the new Indiana Jones game from Machine Games will be an Xbox and PC exclusive and be on Game Pass day one. Pete Hines said that they liked the idea of bringing it to Game Pass day one, getting new players, and because it's on a strict timeline, it allows them to get the game to a higher level of quality than they could if they also had to put it on PS5. This is huge. I think we all kind of knew that this game was going to be exclusive, but Pete pointed out the elephant in the room by stating the fact that games would take much longer to develop if they had to include another platform. It is true that when a game is made, it takes far less effort if you only have to focus on one or two platforms. Since Xbox is a PC-based console, this makes it far easier as the development is already boiled down to one platform. I can guarantee that if Starfield was not exclusive, we would not be getting that game in September this year. I believe that would have been pushed out to next year if they had to include PlayStation. Pete went on to clarify by stating that when ZeniMax was independent, they could not afford to miss, meaning they had to make games for all platforms. When they became part of Microsoft, they helped them to make better games and better calls as to what platform to make said game for. As it relates to Call of Duty, the game that the FTC case is built around, Xbox almost lost the right to have that game on their platform. Bobby Kotick made Microsoft give them a better revenue share in order to keep the game on the Xbox platform. Sarah Bond went on to clarify by stating, "It was clear that the new Call of Duty would be on PlayStation, and it was clear that it would not have been good for Xbox if it wasn't there until the end of the year. He was clear that if we didn't move beyond the current revenue share, then he would not put a Call of Duty on the new Xbox." This was referencing the deal Xbox made with Activision in 2021 in order to keep the game on Xbox. It certainly would have had a very negative effect on the Xbox community, as Call of Duty, whether you love it or hate it, does have a very large fan base that covers all platforms. There were a few things that came out during the course of the day one proceedings that were smaller bits of information, but still relevant, so I want to touch on those real quick. First, it may not come as a surprise, but Phil Spencer has the final say as it relates to game exclusivity. Second, Phil Spencer stated that Xbox lost the, quote, console war. We will dive deeper into that later. New consoles are expected to release in 2028. Outer Wilds 2 might not release on PS5, but the decision has not been made yet. The Xbox Cloud is the least popular Xbox feature. In fact, they spend more money than they make to stream games on the cloud. Sarah said, "The revenue we get per minute per hour from that is lower than the cost we get per minute per hour." So basically, Microsoft is spending more money to keep the servers up and running for the cloud service than they are getting from the users of that service. I think this highlights the fact that Xbox is player-focused even to their own detriment. So day one was really just the opening arguments and a lot of back and forth between the two sides. Look, I get it. Some of you are PlayStation players and you want to see the games you want coming to that platform. Guess what? The same can be said of the Xbox players as it relates to exclusive content on PlayStation. It's never an easy decision to make something exclusive because that means cutting out a certain amount of potential revenue, but what you lose by not sharing said game can also turn into profit over time. That is why Microsoft has kept the cloud service running, even though it cost them a fortune to do so. Day 2 was even more insane than Day 1, with loads of revelations and future release information, along with the Xbox team pretty much annihilating the FTC to the point where even the judge was kind of getting fed up with the FTC's arguments. Speaking about Starfield, Phil Spencer revealed that it was almost a PS5 exclusive. He said, "What I'd say more recently is that the competitor who's paying third parties to skip our platform is that we felt it's necessary for us to secure ownership of more content so we can have more input into that content on our platform and our subscription." He continued, "ZeniMax is a great example of that. When we acquired ZeniMax, one of the impetus for that was that Sony had done a deal for Deathloop and Ghostwire Tokyo, as came up yesterday, to effectively pay Bethesda not to ship those games on Xbox. So the discussion about Starfield, when we heard that Starfield is potentially going to end up skipping Xbox, we can't be in a position as a third place console where we fall further behind on our content ownership. So we've had to secure content in order to remain viable in the business." The point being made here is that Sony was going out and doing the exact same thing that the FTC is arguing against Microsoft on. Sony does this all the time, where they go out and buy content for their platform only, and in doing so, they push their competitors out of the market. This is in large part why Sega was forced to leave the console business. Sony forced them out by taking so much of the content off their platform, effectively making it impossible to compete with them. Xbox was facing this very real possibility. The difference here, though, is that they have quite a bit of a larger purse than Sega had, and they can play the same games Sony is, maybe even better, thus buying up the independent studios so they cannot just be bought off by Sony. At this point, the FTC pointed out that Minecraft had not been optimized for the PlayStation 5, and if PlayStation players wanted to play that game, they would have to play the PlayStation 4 version instead. Phil responded, "Sony was reluctant to send us development kits for PlayStation 5 at the same time they were sending development kits to other developers, which put our game at a disadvantage relative to other PlayStation games that were launching, which put us behind in our development of Minecraft on the PlayStation 5. Now, this one I can understand to a degree. Sony and Microsoft are competitors, so I get the reluctance. However, if this is a choice that is made, then the consequences for that choice is that whatever the game is, it will suffer because of that decision. You can't use that point in an argument that you made the choice yourself." The FTC then asked about The Elder Scrolls 6. They said, "The Elder Scrolls 6 is a ZeniMax game, right?" Phil answered, "It is not a ZeniMax game yet. It is many years away, but it's a game that we've announced that we would begin working on." The FTC continued, "The public announcement also said that there was a plan not to launch the game on PS5, right?" Phil responded, "I think we've been a little unclear on what platforms it's launched on, given how far out the game is. As I said, with The Elder Scrolls 6, it's so far out it's hard to understand what platforms will even be. At this point, it's the same team that's finishing Starfield, which comes out this September." To put a finer point here, we all know that The Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be the next game produced by Bethesda proper, and we know that it is still in the very early stages of development. Based on what Phil just said, it looks like we may not see that game till the next console's release. That news is heartbreaking for many fans, including myself, but I would rather have them take their time than rush through it and produce a crap game that no one wants to see. The FTC then moved to questioning about the Indiana Jones game. Phil said, "So my request for the team was to go back and open up a discussion with Disney, first about ensuring that we could ship our game on Game Pass, and then a discussion about what platforms would be." He continued, "One of Sony's biggest exclusive games, Spider-Man, also a Disney-owned IP that doesn't ship on Xbox, and in competing effectively with them, I think it's important that we have an outside gaming known IP that is part of our portfolio." What Phil is saying here is that Sony has Spider-Man, and Xbox needed something that was well known to compete, so they secured Indiana Jones. The next bit was about Call of Duty, and this is where things get a bit spicy, so I will be running through this line of questioning in full just so that you can see just how ridiculous it was. The judge said, "You're testifying under oath that you will make future versions of Call of Duty available for PlayStation 5? You will invest with the developer. Sony has to let you do that, but you're testifying under oath that you will do that." Phil responded, "Absolutely, I would do it. I would raise my hand. I will do whatever it takes. We have no plans to pull Call of Duty." The judge said, "Putting aside a plan." Phil said, "I'm making a commitment standing here that we will not pull Call of Duty. It is my testimony from PlayStation, and as you said, Sony obviously has to allow us to ship the game on their platform. But absent of any of that, my commitment is, and my testimony is, that we will continue to ship future versions of Call of Duty on Sony's PlayStation 5. He continued, "I made a public statement as the deal was announced where I said that we are committed to continuing to ship Call of Duty on not only the PlayStation 5, but future versions of PlayStation. I'll guess that there will be future PlayStations that we would want to continue and publicly Sony affirmed that they believed our commitment, or my commitment, that we will continue to ship Call of Duty on PlayStation." He later continued, "The Activision games will remain cross-platform. On Call of Duty, just specifically, you asked me the question right before lunch. I want to just be clear. Yes, under testimony, Call of Duty will remain on PlayStation 5 and future versions, as I said of PlayStation. I could imagine maybe somebody thinks there is some kind of game I'm playing on which version of the console that I'm committing to. Our goal is to continue to make Call of Duty a great game for this PlayStation and future versions." At this point, the FTC again asked about Call of Duty. Phil said, "My goal is that we would ship Call of Duty on all versions of PlayStation. I don't own future versions of PlayStation, nor could I even dictate that there are future versions of PlayStation. So I just want to understand exactly the question you are asking." The FTC said, "Can you swear under oath that you can promise that you'll ship Call of Duty on PlayStation, all future versions, whatever that may be, for 10 years without knowing what the terms are that the parties are going to agree to?" The judge then intervened. "No, that's not true. It's not going to be for $0, to which the FTC replied, "Exactly." The judge then said, "Well, no, that was not understood." This is where the judge was kind of done with the question, because the FTC was basically trying to get Phil to write a blank check for Sony to fill out later. The judge was not going to allow them to do that. Right from the start, the judge knew and understood what this was all about and decided to make them move on. So later on in the questioning, the FTC again brought up the 10-year Call of Duty contract with PlayStation. Phil said, "Sony is asking for significant commitments beyond the standard shipping of the game on the platform that has caused, as you said, the deal to go back and forth, even though we know how to ship games at parity on PlayStation, which we do on a regular basis." The FTC said, "Would you make the same promise with respect to all of Activision's content?" Phil responded, "I was asked specifically about Call of Duty. Activision ships games on mobile and many different platforms. They have some PC-only games like World of Warcraft. I don't think there's a blanket statement you can make for Activision Blizzard being on PlayStation. The FTC then said, what about Diablo? Can you promise you'll ship? Phil interrupted, can I promise? I'm able to promise, yes. The FTC then said, you're able to bind Microsoft today? You're able to bind the corporation here today? At which point the judge intervened again, saying, why don't we move along? It was clear that Phil was tired of answering the same question multiple times in multiple ways, to the point where the judge was even forced to make the FTC move on. Now, the questioning did move forward after that, and from all accounts, when the judge said that, there was an audible gasp in the room, and everyone was like, it's best to move forward. Later in the proceedings, Phil was asked why Xbox was making these acquisitions. Phil said, every time we'd sit down with the Microsoft board or leadership team, while they might appreciate our strategy on console and PC, it was pretty clear that if we did not have a strategy that found success on mobile, our relevance in the market was going to continue to shrink. He continued, if you're on the two platforms that are not growing, and there's a third platform called mobile phones, that's the sole source of growth, you're going to be less and less relevant to this platform. So we looked at acquisition as a strategy. This is why Xbox is going after Activision Blizzard. They want King, which is one of the most successful gaming companies in the mobile space. Xbox needs to be able to grow in an area that they really have little to no footprint in. Phil was also asked if there was any truth to the rumor that Microsoft considered selling the Xbox brand, to which he replied, the gaming business inside of Microsoft actually runs as a standalone profit and loss business inside of Microsoft. It's one of the few Microsoft CSS aids, as we've used before, or business that runs that way, and we have a commitment to the company and the board to run a profitable and growing business where we are effectively a standalone business inside of Microsoft. Phil is basically saying that console growth is flat, and that Xbox is not making the goals that have been laid out for them. Again, this is why Xbox needs this deal to go through, because without King, Xbox will end up being on life support, and there is no telling how long it will be before Microsoft decides to sell the brand, or even worse, just shut it down. The FTC moved into talking about the $70 billion that is the cost of acquiring Activision. Phil said, so to try to characterize the $70 billion as somehow spent is incorrect financially. It's really moving $70 billion in cash into an asset, which as a game publisher, that to us is actually worth more than $70 billion, so it's not spent. The FTC said, so the number about the value on the board deck, right? That number is bigger than $70 billion, right? Phil responded, that number is a value to Microsoft, not what we're spending in the market. The FTC then said, quite larger than $70 billion, right? Phil then said, yes, it is. As a company, when you're going to put that much capital, $70 billion, into the market, the company is going to look to make money on the money it spends. So there'd be no reason to look at the transaction if the value to Microsoft was equal or less than what we would spend. Of course, this acquisition is expected to make them more money. No company looks to acquire another company if they're just going to then lose more money after the fact. The simple fact that the FTC had to be told how an acquisition works just speaks to the level of BS that they have been trying to spew. They say they are for the consumer, yet through the first 2 days of proceedings, they mentioned PlayStation over 70 times and only refer to the consumer 10 times. It's very clear that they're doing this solely to aid Sony in keeping its virtual monopoly on the market. Later, the FTC asked Phil, just going back to the commitment, not trying anyone's patience or anything. Phil interrupted, I think you asked me about PlayStation? The FTC said, can you make those same commitments under oath with respect to the cloud? The judge said, what cloud? The FTC replied, Sony's cloud, that you would ship, at which point the judge interrupted again. I don't think that's it. I'm going to cut off this question here. I think the judge had just had enough with that line of questioning and did not want to waste any more time when a question had already been very clearly answered multiple times over. Later, the FTC said Microsoft is going to grow, particularly in a business like console, and it can grow by taking share from its competitors. Phil said, "There's no growth, there's no console growth in our deal model." The FTC said, "I understand, but do you have any intention of this deal helping you climb out of the number 3 spot?" Phil said, "In console? We do not." The FTC then said, "Okay, so it's just a write-off?" Phil said, "I don't understand how it's a write-off." This is just the FTC clearly not understanding what the deal is meant for or how acquisitions work. Phil had stated at one point in the process that Xbox was solidly in 3rd place in terms of market share on console, being significantly behind both Sony and Nintendo. The FTC made it clear that they didn't consider Nintendo a competitor because the Switch is more like a mobile device than a true console. Even if we give them that one, Xbox is still far behind Sony in market share. At one point, the FTC brought in a witness from Stadia to testify, which really didn't help their case at all, as at no point did that person say Xbox was a competitor for them. All in all, it was very clear that the FTC did not really understand why they were even trying to put a stop to the acquisition. So far, this has been a big win for Xbox, as they just took the FTC to school over the past couple of days. There is still a few more hearings yet to come this week, but based on the first 2 days' performance, I don't see the judge ruling against Xbox. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, like, subscribe, and share. And as always, I'm just glad you stopped by, and I'll see you in the next one.